What is voluntarism? Why is it important spiritually? Should society be consent or coercion based? Is the individual or the collective more important? Come on, let's voluntarily access the Akashic records. Welcome to Accessing the Akashic Records, episode 18. What is voluntarism and why is it important spiritually? Voluntarism is known as a right-wing libertarian philosophy whereby all human interaction is to be based on voluntary intention, as opposed to our current coercion-based control system. So as I've explained many a time throughout these episodes, the frequency, energy and characteristic of control is actually a service to self left-hand path. It's not conducive for spiritual evolution of those actually being controlled. However, it is allowed as a path or choice of polarity in this illusion of separation so it can exist. So the negative polarity is just a potential path of choice and experience. Voluntarism also means that all humans have the right to live without being coerced, controlled or aggressed against. So anytime that right is breached, you're within your right to defend with equal force or simply ignore it and continue to exercise that right. Basically, if something is forced, coerced, mandatory, non-consensual, and any of those connotations, is the opposite of voluntarist philosophy. Let's begin with first principles of voluntarism, which is essentially using logic and reason to conclude inherent moral principles. We also find that are the underpinning pedagogical aspect to all spiritual teachings. We'll touch more on that later, but first let's get into the principles. Number one, the principle of non-contradiction. A simple example, an apple cannot not be an apple and it cannot be an orange. And that will not change based on location, time or situation. So no contradiction. Which leads us to number two, the consistency principle. It's still an apple at my house, your house, or anywhere in the universe at any time. This leads us to number three. The burden of proof rests on the active side, not on the passive side. For example, there's essentially an infinite amount of things you're not actually doing right now. And to justify you are not or have not done those things is actually impossible and preposterous. So it leads us to number four. Force is active, so those who wish to take action or have action taken against you must prove you did something and thus must provide evidence for such a claim. Number five, the initiation of force cannot be justified. So, for example, if we go through all the previous principles without failure or contradiction, then force cannot actually be justified. So, say I punch you in the face earlier and wanted to take or advocate for action to be taken against you because you punched me back, that would fail the first principle of contradiction, obviously. And then it fails the consistency principle also because it doesn't matter what time or space, it's still a contradiction. So where or when it happened, it's an actual contradiction. Now, if we said the burden of proof rests on the passive side for not aggressing or using force, this cannot possibly pass the consistency principle, as there's many things that one can do without actually aggressing or using force. Some examples being kissing, sleeping, talking, washing yourself, or actually being the last person alive with no one to actually aggress against. This infallible logic process behind what is known as the non-aggression principle the foundational basis of not only most religions and spiritual teachings, as I've covered already in my eternal law and natural law episodes, but it is the foundation of libertarian or voluntarist philosophy. You may also know this as the golden rule. So if we were to follow the anarchist logic from the previous episode where I explained how authority is being contradictory because it changes based on location and situation, thus it also fails a consistency principle. If one person has it, the other does not. So not only is authority to rule others contradictory, but for the state to rule, it actually uses coercive and violent force up to and including murder. So logically speaking, the two philosophies of anarchism and voluntarism or libertarianism go hand in glove. Back to the principles. Number 6, self-ownership. If you don't own yourself, then who does? So to say anyone can be owned is contradictory and inconsistent. Ownership simply implies autonomy, control, and responsibility. Because if you don't have control and responsibility of yourself, then you cannot actually be held responsible for your actions, words, thoughts, and so forth. Thus, justice becomes impossible in a world where we do not own ourselves and have that autonomy and control and responsibility. 7, private property. Now, for an example, if you grew an apple orchard, I can offer to trade you an orange for an apple or offer my labour in exchange. Private property can be seen as an extension of personal property. Thus, a personal property can be seen as an extension of self-ownership. 8th and final principle, the taking of legitimately owned property cannot be justified. So, for example, if I took your apples without consent, I've actually stolen your property and consequently your labour. Thus failed the first principles in the non-aggression principle. So, of course, property can actually be transferred to compensate for, say, damages or theft or a failure to meet a contract or agreement. So if owning of property is passive and the taking is active, the burden of proof is on the active. Therefore, it must be justified, and in the absence of an agreed upon contract or terms, it cannot be deemed voluntary. Thus, it's an aggressive action, and assumed consent is never justifiable. So this means the government's existence and actions can never be justified. So let me explain a little further. Because government is an actual territorial monopoly on the initiation of coercion and violence, so thus it fails the non-aggression principle, thus is the antithesis of voluntarism and libertarian philosophy. Tax violates the self-ownership and private property as it takes what was always yours. It's the taking of legitimately owned property. Legislation violates the non-aggression principle as it's forcing people to involuntarily act in a certain way. So it's the use of force and authorization of violence. It is not required under natural law, which already covers the fact that harming others for any reason other than defense is out of harmony with natural law. So it's very arbitrary manslaughter or legislation. So we can say if it is voluntary, not under some form of coercion, then it is logically sound. Now, if you were to voluntarily agree to be a slave, then that wouldn't be in your best interest regarding spiritual growth or evolution, but it's your free will choice to do so, and free will actually trumps natural law as it's a higher order law. But other than that, if it isn't voluntary, it's actually slavery. Now, obviously, living in a voluntarist-based society would be most conducive for spiritual growth and evolution, as free will be held paramount. So as long as it causes no harm to others, the self or the environment, then it's permitted. Of course, there's no guarantee that all would abide by it, but if voluntarism or libertarianism is part of a society's basic foundational philosophy, then that society will be able to evolve far more swiftly and will in turn show those who wish to dominate and control others by demonstrating exactly how the opposite is superior for evolution. The opposite philosophy is collectivism, where the individual's rights come second to the totality of that society. So if that society decides on something, then it's reasonable to force that decision upon the individual if they do not wish to voluntarily make that choice in life. You may recognise this as our current model of democracy. This is also the contrast between centralisation of control, being collectivism, and decentralisation of control, being individualism. You may be aware there is many sects of anarchism and libertarian philosophy. The communism economic model holds a collectivist philosophy, while the voluntarism holds a sovereign individualist philosophy. You may also be aware of history where this seemingly benevolent collectivist philosophy has had disastrous consequences on humanity, where the suppression of free will and genocide of millions of individuals has been acceptable under the guise of for the greater good of the collective or the majority. So while on the surface it sounds benevolent to do what is in the best interest of the collective or the majority, that can easily result in breaching the free will, or worse, the killing of individuals. So needless to say, if it's doing that, then it's not actually a benevolent, positive polarity philosophy. I've put a lot of time into understanding communism and collectivist philosophy to attempt to see how it could actually work on the basis of a benevolent society. However, when I followed it to its logical conclusion, it fails the first principle of non-contradiction and the second of consistency, where the individual doesn't have the rights that the collective have. Therefore, it's a breach of the non-aggression principle or golden rule that is definitely going to occur if that philosophy is foundational. So the only way I could see collectivism working is once society has reached a point of evolution in consciousness, known as social memory, where telepathy and access to the Akashic records has been reached by that civilization. So if you want to dig more into that, please watch my very first episode, our very first Accessing the Akashic Records episode. But I digress, as we currently live in the 3D with a very thick veil that separates our conscious mind from the roots of our mind. And I will cover the roots of the mind in a future episode and go into what's accessible in the roots of our mind at different levels. But for now, let's continue on. Basically, hopefully so far I've sufficiently shown you how anarchism and voluntarism do go hand in glove. Anarchy being that there's no authority over the individual is master over themselves, and living accordingly to natural law is to be in harmony with eternal law. Voluntarism being that those individuals must respect each other's free will choice unless it infringes on another or causes harm. Again, if it isn't voluntary, it is slavery. So thank you for watching. I hope this episode sparks something deep within you to create positive change so we can see more of it in the world that we exist in. So please hit like, subscribe, share this around, and implement it into your life. I see you other self. Love and light to you. See you in the next episode on agorism.